All right, welcome everyone to the fifth and final Future of College Sports episode of 2020. We're really excited today to have a really great speaker joining us, Tom McMillen, who's the CEO and president of Lead1 organization. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Zack Flagel, and I'm a 3L at Duke Law, and also the director and founder of the Future of College Sports Initiative. The Future of College Sports series is really a student-run Zoom podcast series where we have conversations with big-time key stakeholders in the national dialogue for NCAA reform in general, and specifically the name, image, and likeness debate that's going on today. And we're committed to having a variety of perspectives from all facets and views of the debate. So in the past, we've had people like on the policymaker side, such as Senators Cory Booker and Chris Murphy, as well as the state level side with Chip LaMarca, who's a congressman in the state of Florida. And then we've also had other executives, DeMaurice Smith, the NFLPA executive director, also Ramogi Huma. This past Tuesday, we had an event with him, and he's the National College Players Association executive director as well. For any students on the call who are interested in getting involved, we'd love to, this is a student-run initiative, and we'd love to have as many people involved as possible who are really interested and passionate about this topic. So if that applies to you, we encourage you to reach out at futureofcollegesports@gmail.com. Today's event is a special one because it's a partnership with the University of Maryland's Entertainment, Arts, and Sports Law Organization. EASL, I think, is the appropriate name to call it. And I'm really stoked to have their president, Connor Tilson, to join me today as a co-host. And so today, a little bit run through of how the event will go. Connor, in just a minute, is going to jump into the introduction of Tom McMillen, and then we'll kick off the conversation for around 30 to 40 minutes. And then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So if anyone has any questions, we encourage you to message us. Just message me on the chat function or Connor with your question, and we'll be sure to call on you during the Q&A segment, time permitting. And so now I'll turn it over to my co-host, Connor Tilson, to introduce Tom and get us started. Connor?
Thank you, Zach. I appreciate it. First off, I just want to say thank you to Mr. McMillen for taking the time to be here today with us, and we're very excited to hear your thoughts. And I also want to thank all the participants for being here today. I could spend the whole hour talking about Tom's decorated achievements, but just so we can get into some questions, I'll try to be brief. Tom McMillen began his career as an All-American Hall of Fame basketball player at the University of Maryland, and then was a first-round draft pick in the NBA and ABA drafts, after which he had an 11-year NBA career and was a member of the 1972 Olympic team. He was valedictorian of his class and a Rhodes Scholar. After his playing career, Mr. McMillen then went into politics, serving in the 4th District of Maryland in the House of Representatives. After his time as Congress, Tom served as the co-chair of President Clinton's Council of Fitness and Sports and was a member of the Board of Regents at the University of Maryland system. He was a founding member of the Knight Commission, and currently Tom is the president and CEO of Lead1 Association, representing athletic directors at the Football Bowl Subdivision level. So thank you for being here with us today, Tom. Just to start off, this is a personal highlight for me, talking to someone in the Maryland Hall of Fame. I would love to just start off hearing about your time at Maryland. Did you enjoy being a Terp, and just talking about your overall experience at the University of Maryland?
Well, Maryland was a great experience for me. I was highly recruited out of high school. Part of it was because I was the second high school player on the cover of Sports Illustrated. So all these coaches were coming to my little small town in Pennsylvania to recruit me. And I chose Maryland because I felt that going to Maryland, where they never really had a great program, would be something that I could be self-actualized by really building something from scratch. And as opposed to going to, which I almost went to Carolina grade school, where they had an existing program and had a lot of tradition to it. Going to Maryland under Lefty Driesell was, in a way, you were a pioneer. And it actually turned out very well, because Maryland, we ended up having a great great basketball team and all that. But in addition to that, when I was in high school, I was appointed by President Nixon to the youngest member of the President's Council on Physical Fitness and Sports. As you mentioned, I co-chaired that later on under President Clinton, but I was the youngest presidential appointee ever, and I think I still am. And so the opportunity to go to Washington and be near Washington was very meaningful to me. I worked in the Senate when I was at Maryland, and all in all, the Maryland experience was just terrific. I was a chemistry major at Maryland. That was a very tough curriculum to do and to play basketball at the same time because you have all the labs in the afternoon and so forth. So the Maryland experience, in totality, being able to achieve my academic goals of being valedictorian and a Rhodes Scholar, and also helping the Maryland basketball team build a tradition and going on having, just a great program was very fulfilling to me.
Awesome, thank you. And as you mentioned, you were a standout basketball player with a decorated college and professional career. I was just wondering how your playing experience and how you've lived out the student athlete life, how is informs and shapes your views today in regards to the future of college athletics?
Well, it's changed a lot. The pressures on college athletes are so much greater today than they were when I was in school. I couldn't play as a freshman. They didn't allow that. We had a freshman team. We only played 16 games. We were the #1 team in the country. But having that year to get adjusted to college was very, very important. And, we played probably 5 to 7 games less than student athletes play today. So it's become more and more commercialized, more competitive. The time demands on student athletes are even more extreme. But in my case, I had to balance being a chemistry major, which was no small task, and also being, playing in a world-class basketball league, the ACC, and also doing other things. I was on the President's Council on Physical Fitness and Sports, and I had other outside activities. So it was a juggling act for me. It's just twice as hard today to do all those things. I'm not even sure that I could be a chemistry major today. I looked around the NBA when I was playing. There was only a couple guys in the NBA who were chemistry majors. Jack Marin, an old friend of mine from Duke, a Duke basketball player, great basketball player at Duke, was a chemistry major. There were probably just 1 or 2 players I knew that could do that, because your labs would run for 3 hours in the afternoon. Oftentimes I was late for practice. So the bottom line is that I was able to do it. It was a big juggling act. I had to really manage my time. But today, the demands are even greater. And so it's a high hurdle for these kids.
Yeah, and that touches on my first question. But before I ask that question, I do want to say that, Tom, you actually have the honor of being the 3rd Rhodes Scholar that we've had in our short series here. Cory Booker, obviously, was also a Rhodes Scholar. And then the Duke Law sports law professor, Paul Hagan, is another Rhodes Scholar. So it's a collection that we're honored to have you be a member of.
Thank you.
Going off of your your comments just now about how what it's like being a college athlete has evolved over time. We know that you've been a man of many hats and many perspectives as well. From the time that Connor mentioned, as a standout player, that in today's age, you'd likely, someone like you would stand to benefit from name, image, and likeness. And then you had your time as a policymaker in our nation's top legislative body, and you actually passed sports-related legislation there. And in your role now as Lead1, representing the interests of athletic directors. And you've even also written a book, right, called
Yes.
Out of Bounds, that touches on these issues as well. How do you feel that your perspective on college athletes reform, and specifically name, image, and likeness, how has your perspective changed and shifted over time?
Well, it really hasn't changed a great deal. In 1991, when I wrote my book, I pointed out, that these growing coaches' salaries were going to be a problem. They were just crossing $1 million in 1991. Well, now they're crossing $10 million. And I say to people about my book's very relevant today. All you just need to do is add a zero to all the numbers. Just add another zero. So as opposed to $1 million, it's now 10 million in compensation, which I think demonstrates over the last 25, 30 years, the accelerating commercialization of college sports. There's just more money in it. But you know something, the truth of the matter is money doesn't make sports better. We played just as hard when I was in school. The games were just as good. Matter of fact, one of the games I played in my senior year at Maryland was an overtime game against North Carolina State in the ACC tournament, which many people think is one of the greatest college basketball games of all time. The fact is that there wasn't as much money sloshing around the system. My coach, Lefty Drizel, when he came to coach at Maryland, I think he made $25,000. He might have gotten up to $75,000 a few years later, but the money that has come into college sports has also accentuated the pressures on student athletes, the pressures to win, and all of that. I personally don't think money makes it better. I think it just makes it, it just enhances the pressure in some cases unnecessarily. You know, the game, when you go out and play a basketball game, like when I did when I was in college, you know, you play just as hard, you practice just as hard. What you don't have, what I didn't have, was the sophistication, the tremendous training techniques, the weightlifting, all the things that the kids have today. You know, the counseling, and not that I didn't really need that, but all the support systems that student athletes have today are so much greater than when I played. And so that's the big difference.
Now, given what you just mentioned about the growing role of athletic directors and their offices, specifically on university campuses across the country, you know, with regards to financial capacity, but also the types of services that they've offered, I'm wondering, how exactly does Lead1 fit into the broader college sports landscape? Can you give this like an overview of the mission of your organization to those in the audience who might not be fully in the know of what Lead1 is all about?
No, thank you. It's a good question. You know, our primary mission is to shape the rules of college sports. The people who are the CEOs of these athletic programs across the country, the EDs, they run these $100 million enterprises, $150 million enterprises. Collectively, our 130 schools represent $8 billion of revenue. And that includes all the sports. And these are really big enterprises, big businesses. And these practitioners, these CEOs, oftentimes they want to make sure their voice is heard. And so we work very hard on shaping the rules of college sports. You mentioned NIL. Well, we spent enormous amount of time submitting comments to the NCAA, talking to our schools, our staff, our ADs, and then putting comments together, responding to legislation, trying to steer the legislation that the NCAA produces so that it is, you know, so that it's simpatico with the views of our ADs. And we do that continually, not just on name, image, and likeness, but transfers and financial aid and academic issues. And so our biggest role is trying to shape the rules of college sports. Our second part of that is we also work on communication and messaging and trying to explain to the general public, to policymakers, whatever, some of the issues about college sports. So a lot of times policymakers, I think we're in a classic example that with NIL, don't completely understand the collegiate model. And so we spend time trying to explain to folks and to the general public and to policymakers what's entailed here. And that's a big role we play. So those are our two two big functions. And our third is to educate our members. We've been doing, I think we're up to almost 30 webinars we've done since COVID on every type of subject imaginable. You know, what's going on with bowls, name, image, and likeness, COVID testing, how do you deal with your budgets in this time of stress? So we work on providing content to our members as well.
I'd love to pick up on the first prong that you mentioned, and specifically in your discussions with athletic directors on name, image, and likeness in particular. Obviously, this is a hot topic going on, and something that we'll see a lot of change in some way in the next few months and over 2021. But right now, we've seen dozens of policy proposals thrown out there from several different legislative bodies, from the NCAA coming up with their own regulation proposals to 5 different states now, including California and Florida. And now Congress is stepping in and attempting to address potentially in 2021 the name, image, and likeness issue. If from discussions with you and from discussions with your members, if you and your members could have your way, how should NIL be addressed moving forward, and by whom would be most ideal?
I don't think this is a monolithic response. I'm going to say that a lot of our ADs feel very differently about these issues, but in general, I would say, and the proposals that we submitted to the NCAA are for a low regulation model. And a low regulation model means that, you know, giving student athletes a chance to monetize their publicity rights, which, as you know, as law students, is really an inherent right. Monetize those rights, but do it in a way that's not overly burdensome with regulation. But there is one caveat to that, and that is the caveat that the difference between college sports and any other endeavor is there's recruiting. There is no recruiting in any other sports endeavor in America like there is in college. And so the concern of our ADs is that name, image, and likeness inherently is, you know, our ADs are in full agreement with it as long as it's name, image, and likeness. It's not used as a subterfuge for recruiting or a way to, you know, to induce a student athlete to come to an institution. That's where it gets very, very tricky. So if you're an institution and you're able to bring young student athletes in based upon very lucrative NIL opportunities in your area, the line that has to be drawn is what is bona fide name, image, and likeness, and what is really a subterfuge for recruiting. And that's the big concern of our members. And some go so far, some of our more conservative ADs will say, look, my fear is that when this gets out there, over the majority of NIL deals will be recruiting induced, and that they won't be inherent to the student athletes' publicity rights. That's a fear, that's a concern, because then all of a sudden, how do you keep a level competitive playing field? Or, and many argue that it's not level right now. Different schools have different budgets and all that, and that's absolutely true. But the recruiting area is the one area that they've tried hard, sometimes too much so, because the rule book gets very exhaustive, to try to maintain some kind of balance. It's not a perfect process, but here's the concern. The big concern is that NIL turns into sort of the recruiting Wild West, and not really monetizing these student athletes' basic publicity rights, which most of our ADs, if not all, are fully in support of.
Now, I guess on that point, how exactly do you think these types of regulations, whether on the congressional level or the state level or NCAA level, you know, in your perspective, how should the regulations account for recruiting differences that might come about because of these types of NIL rules?
Well, what we've proposed is, and I think we were one of the organization that coined the expression of a third-party administrator, or TPA. That's actually a healthcare term. Third-party administrators are it's very prevalent in healthcare, and we propose that kind of concept where you'd have a middleman, basically kind of vetting the deals and making sure they fall within the realm of normalcy. Even the NCAA has recently supported that concept, which we think is essential, so that you get the schools out of this and you have an independent third party sort of arbitrating kind of right and wrong here. We do think that's necessary because, as I said, colleges are the only place where you don't recruit to the YMCA, you don't recruit to Little League to any great extent, you don't recruit much to high schools, but recruiting is really paramount in college sports. And we need to have some kind of filter. So we feel that if you can have a third-party administrator that gets smarter and smarter over time using algorithms, artificial intelligence and everything, it's going to be able to take a deal the student athlete proposes, and they're going to be able to say that fits within the norm. If you're a third string quarterback on a team, or a second string basketball player, and you're getting a $50,000 car dealer appearance or $50,000 social influencing deal, obviously those kinds of deals have to be red flag, because they're not really inherently publicity rights. They are, recruiting subterfuge. And those are our big, that's the big concern. And if that can be handled carefully, I think all of our athletic directors feel that student athletes should have a right to monetize their publicity rights like any other student on the campus.
Now, since we've had a lot of guests on the future of college sports before, we've had a lot of different perspectives on this exact recruiting issue. And some of the arguments that other folks have mentioned have been that obviously the recruiting environment in college sports today, isn't balanced, and it isn't even to begin with. Schools like my own, Duke, will always attract the top basketball players. And schools like Alabama football will always attract the top football players. And so that's one argument that we've heard, in terms of how much more can the recruiting environment be changed. And then another argument I think that we've heard is that different ways that schools have attracted different players is through having great coaches or a great reputation, but specifically coaches and facilities, and how a lot of revenue that schools have produced have gone towards increasing the inducements through just lavish facilities and whatnot, or just high paying coaches who will bring a strong reputation. So I guess in response to that, how do you see recruiting really becoming a difficulty or a troubled thing here, if the balance already at place is kind of favors the bigger name schools like the ones that whose ADs you represent?
There's no question. Ohio State has been winning in football for generations. Duke has always had great basketball programs. There's truth to that. But the fact is, if you look at the professional leagues, they have tools to maintain competitive balance. They have, they revenue sharing, and they have salary caps. They do things through collective bargaining to try to make sure, in certain cases, that small city have just as much chance of winning as a large city. And so the pros do that because they understand that that's good for their business. Now, colleges have tried to do that. They do not have all the tools. In 1989, they tried to limit assistant coaches' salaries to a level that would be reasonable for a higher education institution. Well, that got thrown out of court because of antitrust reasons. And now you have assistant coaches almost making $2 million. And so the NCAA does not have the tools. Every time they try to impose a lot of things, they oftentimes get sued. Now, they do have a lot of things. They limit the amount of coaches you can have. They limit the scholarships. They try to do a lot of things to limit competitive balance, but it's very imperfect, and I'd be the first to admit that. The concern here is that this will just be the Wild West for recruiting, and it's going to just exacerbate the divisions. The divisions are already there. The smaller schools, a group of 5 schools, cannot keep up with the larger schools. And personally, and taking off my Lead1 hat, I think that's a problem for college sports. When you exacerbate the differences across these various schools, you know, it really makes it hard for a smaller school to keep up. If you look at our smaller group of 5 schools, they're suffering enormously. They can't keep up. Listen, they don't have big television contracts. They don't have fans coming to their games right now. Their sponsorship dollars are down, and COVID certainly has exacerbated that. So I think the idea here is in the perfect world, and it's not perfect, is to try to create some kind of balance. And the NCAA does not have the tools that the pro leagues have. And that's why I think a lot of our ADs are concerned that this will just be, you know, another way to induce kids into the school. And that's what they're concerned about, quite frankly.
Awesome, thank you. My next question's relating to the education aspect. So whenever the NIL era arrives, whether it's in the near or distant future, my feeling is at the beginning, there might likely be a gap between what the new rules and regulations are and what the college athletes' understanding of these rules and regulations to be. So my question is, what level of responsibility or role, if any, will the ADs and universities have in educating the college athletes about the new NIL laws, in shrinking the gap or even making the gap non-existent between understanding these rules?
Connor, that's a very good question. I think it strikes to the heart of what universities are about. It's about education, and branding is one area where you can teach young student athletes about personal branding. Look, a lot of these athletes monetizing their publicity rights in college may be the only time in their life that they can monetize their athletic ability, because very few of them are going to go into professional ranks and earn a compensation for their skills. Many football players will play their last game at Duke or Maryland or whatever their senior year. And so having universities teach young athletes about how to brand themselves, how to use YouTube, how to use social media, how to use Instagram, how to do that is exceedingly important and very much incongruent with what institutions of higher learning should be doing. So I'm very pleased that the NCAA will allow that kind of branding and training and so forth. And there's going to be a whole cottage industry arise in this country of teaching young athletes how to do this. One of the great things about NIL is that it won't just go towards the star athlete. Many of these benefits will go to athletes that are in some of the minor sports who are just good at social media. Matter of fact, if you look at the top social influencers on TikTok and on YouTube, they're not the star athlete. The ones that have the biggest followers are oftentimes not well-known sports, and they're the ones that have just learned how to really play this game. And so I think that's a really important role for universities to play and teach them how to brand themselves.
Awesome, appreciate it. And then switching over to health and safety obligations, in light of the Maryland and Jordan McNair tragedy, I was wondering if after that incident, the roles of athletic directors and ensuring coaches are protecting their players, if there's been any shift in their duties or roles after that.
Well, I was on the commission at Maryland that studied that, and one of our recommendations was we need to adhere to a medical model where those kinds of decisions are delegated to professionals, medical professionals, not to athletic department personnel. And more universities are moving into that medical model. The University of Maryland did. They have a partnership with the University of Maryland medical system, and I would say many of our schools are moving to that close partnership where these kinds of things, whether it's concussions or heat strokes or anything, are overseen by competent medical professionals, not those that may not have that kind of training. So that hopefully is one of the positive things that comes out of such a tragedy like that, where we do rely on medical professionals for those very important decisions.
With our last few minutes before we open up to questions, Tom, I'd love to get your thoughts on the Division I revenue model that many institutions have today, and how COVID has been impacting that. How serious has it been? What have you heard from different ADs that this last year has been on the D1 economic model? And how long could we legitimately sustain this type of season that we've had this year with limited fan attendance and the NCAA, at least football or basketball, strictly being a TV show? Is that possible, a possible future?
Well, I mean, it's been our Armageddon for our schools. If you go to the Group of 5 schools, as I said earlier, not only do they not have fans, but they don't have television contracts. Their sponsorships are down. Their student fees are down because kids aren't on campus, and their institutional support is down because institutions are hurting and can't provide the same largesse that they normally pay. And the larger schools are facing the same thing. As you know, Connor, my alma mater just had to cancel the second game, football game, consecutive game. And the Coach Loxley has COVID. That is dramatic impact on our schools. And it's going to be a very trying year for our schools. But there's a positive side to it. And there are discussions about what does the college model need to be sustainable. I mean, you can't have just 30 or 40 schools in America playing college sports. I mean, what would happen to the thousands of other schools that want to be competitive? And so we need to look at the model. I mean, are there things we can do? Can we slow the arms race down? I mean, certainly the compensation escalation has been a big problem for a lot of schools. The small schools can't keep up. The buyouts that are occurring in college sports are excessive. In the last 3 years, we've had over $200 million of buyouts of contracts for coaches that are no longer coaching. And, in many ways, that is not consistent with higher education. I mean, when you get rid of your president, you don't give them 5-year contracts to go sit on the beach. And so we need to think about some of these things. States are already looking at it. Illinois and Florida have looked at these kinds of things. And, if college sports doesn't get a hold of this, you're going to see states and the federal government be doing it. And so it's incumbent upon the system. I actually believe that, it's the Rudyard Kipling, the strength of the pack is in the wolf, but the strength of the wolf is in the pack. The strength of college sports is all the schools together, not just a few surviving. And so we have to, I think COVID has raised issues about this kind of Darwinian kind of nature of college sports, that the strongest survive, but that may be not the model for the future. We really need a robust, strong group of schools in America that can provide, opportunities for student athletes, second to the GI Bill in this country, but do it in a way that all these schools can compete. And that's a big philosophical issue. That's going to be one that has to be tackled. I don't have the answers. As you said, I proposed a lot of bills when I was in Congress. Some passed on college sports. And I think we're going to have to take a look at these things down the road again.
Now, last question before we open it up to the audience Q&A segment. Kind of picks up on these large, powerful schools, and one trend that we've started seeing with some of them that I want to see what your thoughts are, and that's the cutting of non-revenue sports. We've seen that Stanford a few months ago cut 11 varsity sports teams, and just this month, last week, Clemson cut track and field and cross country. And these are just two examples of an unfortunate trend that's been developing. Does this trend concern you, and what do you think is causing underneath it?
It's a big concern, and it's a concern for our ADs as well. When I was on the University of Maryland board, we had to cut 7 or 8 teams. It's the worst thing you can do as a university is have to tell these kids that their sport's been cut. And it's happening all over the country, and COVID's exacerbated it. And it's not good for college sports. College sports should be about broad opportunities. It's also important for our Olympic effort. 70-80% of the athletes in the Summer Olympics come from our colleges. And if you decimate these Olympic sports, who's going to provide that farm system, that feeder system for the Olympics? Our staff did some calculations on this, and our schools spend $2 billion a year on all these Olympic sports, and those are being cut. And if you look at an $8 billion enterprise and $2 billion is spent on all these sort of non-revenue sports, that's literally all your profits. So in a way, college sports takes all of its profits and puts it into these other areas. And we're seeing that go away because of the increasing commercialization and professionalization of college sports. And I don't think that's a good thing. I think college sports should be about broad-based opportunities. And I might want to add one other thing. You know, with a new president, Title IX could be looked at in a different way now. You're going to have more and more scrutiny about women's sports under the Biden administration. And so more to come on that issue, because I do think that it's one of the core issues. The last thing I think you want to have happen in college sports is that we shrink down to just basketball and football and Title IX compliance. We would lose thousands and thousands of student athlete opportunities if we did that. We have to be careful not to head in that direction, because broad-based opportunities is what college sports should be all about.
Yeah, and I totally agree, and I'm sure many on the call do as well. With that note, I'd like to open it up to audience Q&A segment. And the first one we'll go to is Viraj Paul. Viraj, if you're there, if you can turn on your screen and ask your question, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, hi, my name is Viraj Paul. I'm currently a senior at Georgetown University, and recently just got accepted into Duke Law, so I might be going there next year. But
congrats, Viraj, that's awesome. Well,
thank you.
Let me know if you have any insight after or need.
Absolutely, will do. Yes, my question was with the recent G League pathway program in the NBA. How do you believe that in general, like high school athletes, a lot of times in basketball, choosing professional options over the NCAA? How's that going to impact the NCAA going forward in both quality of play and revenue? And then also, how much do you think the NIL will affect this balance and help to attract top basketball talent to the NCAA?
Well, to your first question, this might surprise you, but I've been saying this since 1980s and 1990s when I wrote my book, was that there needs to be pathways for kids who don't want to go to college. If they're good enough, they ought to have a pathway to go into professional sports without necessarily going into college. I mean, forcing kids like football to go through college doesn't make sense. And the second thing is that you asked the question, what would that mean to college sports? And I probably would, some would disagree with me on this, but I think our ADs feel this way, that if you took the top 20 college players out of college basketball and they went into the pros, it wouldn't hurt the college game. A lot of our ADs would think that the college game is built on a different fundamental. It's built on the loyalty of the fans, the alumni, just the whole excitement of college sports. And if some of these great athletes went into the pros, it might be their loss. They're going to lose that great branding opportunity to play at Duke or to play at Maryland. And so, but if a kid doesn't want to be in school, they ought to have a pathway to not have to go to school. And that's fundamental. And the second part, I think NIL, as I said, the other factor I think that our ADs are concerned about is, will that create a little bit of a caste system on some of these teams where, one of the star quarterback may be getting $250,000 NIL benefits, but, one of the linebackers is not. And that's another concern of our ADs, is that you could create this, and coaches, you'll create a caste system in college sports. And what I fear about college sports is that we're going to see too much of a professionalization of college sports. And if we keep going down that road where athletes get NIL rights and then maybe they go for more rights, maybe they want some of the revenue as some, as Senator Murphy and others are doing, proposing, and maybe they want to have collective bargaining. What I fear is that when you get to a full professionalization of college sports, is that what higher education should be about in America? Do you want a professional team on your campus? And some will say, well, they're already halfway there. There's no question that the compensation and all that has, and the arms race and facilities has gone down that pathway, partly because the NCAA doesn't have any tools to stop it. But is the answer to it to try to fully professionalize it, give kids full collective bargaining, give them a piece of the revenues? Those are questions. And by the way, the byproduct of that is you're going to get rid of all your non-revenue sports. Is that the model of college sports you want? Or do we want to go back to a model where we provide broad-based opportunities to kids? We give kids an opportunity to go directly to the pros that don't want to go to college. And we keep college sort of connected to the institutions of higher learning. What I worry about is if you go the full professional model, you're disconnecting from the higher education model. And that in the long run may be damaging to college sports.
Awesome. Thank you. Our next question is going to go to Nick Tilson. So if you want to turn on your mic, you're up.
Hey, I'm Nick. I'm Connor's younger brother. I'm a senior at the University of South Carolina. My question is, due to the economic impact of coronavirus, as well as the emergence of name, image, and likeness compensation for athletes, how do you think smaller schools are going to remain competitive in college sports when athletes might be seeking larger schools for more exposure?
Well, it's an interesting question, Nick, and I'll tell you that, as I said to you earlier, the greatest social influencers on TikTok and YouTube are not from big schools. I think there's an athlete from the University of Central Florida that has a tremendous social influencing following. So I don't think it matters where you're from as much, although there is concern that if you're in a more robust market, you'll have more opportunities. Because I think where NIL is going is that social influencing, more of this will be digital than real life. In other words, where we think of NIL and publicity rights, we think of the car dealership, the appearances and all that. Certainly they'll be part of it. But I do believe that the digital marketplace is going to be much bigger. And that's open for anybody that really wants to learn how to brand themselves. So I don't get too worried about that issue. I think smaller schools that build their branding departments and teach these kids can be just as successful at it as a large school. And I also think that this will work for, women athletes, some of the minor sports, some of the Olympic sports. I think it's time will tell, but I don't think that necessarily has to be a hindrance just because they're in a smaller market.
All right, next up we'll have Thayer Walmsley. Thayer?
Hi, my name's Thayer. I'm in a similar position as Viraj, except I'm here at Vanderbilt. But I had a question regarding kind of the NCAA and its lack of teeth, so to speak, when it comes to many issues and kind of its leverage mechanisms. And so specifically, do you think the NCAA is still useful for the enforcement of the NIL regulations and maybe some other standards? Or do you think we need a new locus of power given the new pressures around college sports that you've already spoken to?
That's a good question. And as I mentioned earlier, we were proposing a third-party administrator to sort of approve, disapprove deals and to liaison with the schools and the NCAA about these things. But really the filter would be that TPA. I think most people, and even the NCAA, and certainly our schools, want to get this off their backs. They don't want this responsibility. I mean, for give you an example, if you're a young student athlete, you bring a social influencing deal to the school or to the third-party administrator, the school doesn't necessarily have the capability of monitoring and providing oversight of that deal. But a TPA that learns over time and gets more experience would. And so I think in that instance, we do need a third-party filter. As far as the NCAA, one of the problems I think that's happened in college sports is the governance has become fractionated. Since the 1987 Supreme Court decision and the growth of television money through the conferences have become sort of mini television conglomerates, and they have power, they have money, and they control the football playoff and all that, while the NCAA controls the basketball playoff. And yet the NCAA still has to administer and enforce the football rules. So there's a situation in college sports where the governance is not clear. Certainly the NCAA has the responsibility to enforce and to make the rules, but the money is oftentimes elsewhere. It's at the conference level. And that's a problem. And you see it right now. You saw it with this COVID situation. And when they were trying to decide when to play and who could play and how they would play football this year, everybody did something differently. The NCAA put out some broad guidelines, but each conference took it upon themselves. There was no uniformity. And that's a model that's going to be tested over time and see. And how if you were designing college sports, would you say, wow, that's a very fragmented model. Who is in charge? And and the answer to that is, we're not sure. And this recent COVID situation was a classic example of where you have a very dispersed governance model where the NCAA is titularly in charge, but obviously a lot of the money and the power is at the conference level. So that's something that's going to have to work out over time, but it does manifest itself in problems, as we've seen just recently in this whole decisions about football. And it's also very much apparent in the whole NIL discussions. The conferences have their own lobbyists. They're working Capitol Hill on behalf of what their interests are, and the NCAA as well. So you don't have a unified front. And is that good? Is that bad? I think time will tell. I think it's a challenging, we'll put it that way.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, these questions are fantastic. Let's move on next to Len Simon. Len is an advisor to our Future of College Sports initiative. So we'd love to have Len, if you're ready, to ask a question.
I am. I tried to get my picture on there, but I can't do it. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. Hi, Tom. How you doing? As you may recall, I'm in San Diego, and my phone's ringing, of course. And I teach sports and law at the University of San Diego, and occasionally I lecture at Duke, and met Zack and some of the other students there. I've been following NIL really since the California bill got started, and written several articles about it. And I'm reading the Division I proposals closely, and the Division II and III proposals a little more quickly because I got them yesterday. And I guess we could talk about this for an hour, and we don't have it. So let's talk about it for a minute. I think there's too many words and too many rules and too many prohibitions, and leaving aside all the substance, everything we might want to say about what the schools, what the NCAA should or should not permit. The rules as proposed create a huge trap for the unwary of students not understanding what they can and can't do. And I'm not concerned about the next Zion Williamson, because he will have a professional advisor. I'm a whole lot more concerned about a lacrosse player at Maryland or Duke or Hopkins, or a wrestler someplace, or a cross-country runner without an agent who doesn't have a clue whether they can get a $1,000 deal here or a $500 deal there, or put something on social media and make a little bit of money. And I guess it's just a message to you, Tom. I'd love to have your reaction to it, but just a message that less can be more sometimes here. And I think fewer rules applicable to fewer athletes might make a whole lot of sense. You got non-scholarship athletes, you got D2 and D3, non-rev athletes. Most of them are not Zion. And there's a lot of places you can lose your eligibility here if people are going to seriously enforce the rules. Well,
Len, first of all, if you go on our website, Lead1's website, we're putting up all of our comment letters that we've made to the NCAA. We had an NIL work group working on this issue for many months. And that's generally been our theme. We supported and we proposed a low regulation model. We did that for the reasons you just cited, but there's also a second reason, which is you're not going to pass a high regulation model either at the federal level or at any state level. It's clear that if you look at the state bills that have passed or in the queue, and even the bills that are proposed on the Hill, they're fairly low regulation models. That's why we felt having a third party intermediary makes a lot of sense. And it also protects the student athlete, to your point, which is that, they can call somewhere, they can reach out and say, look, someone offered me this social media deal, and if I sell my jerseys along with it, I can get $10,000. They need somewhere to go. It can't be the school. And that's why we propose having that intermediary. But I generally agree with you. I think that, in the case of legislation, it should be streamlined and a lot simpler. And the other thing is quite clear here is that the NCAA is on a time clock because Florida goes effective on July 1. And it's very, very unlikely that the Congress will get to this in a lame duck session, or even will get to it in the beginning of the new administration. So, they could very well miss the July 1st deadline. And then the question is what happens next? And I think the NCAA will probably hold off, not do anything, because they do want to come up with a bill that works, and they don't want to be sued every time they turn around. So you need to have a model that protects them against, a million lawsuits, which is what they're concerned about. And to your point, keeping it simple and a low regulation model probably makes the most sense.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Len. And for our last question, we'll turn to James James.
Thank you so much for today's session. So I have one question. I'm wondering that the COVID-19 sports regimen most likely will be operated using the waiver consent as to litigation regarding COVID-19 or health injuries.
Yeah, I didn't understand. You broke up. Zach, could you repeat that for me? Or
Yeah,
I get the question.
Okay, Jake, go ahead.
James, is your question regarding the waiver consent with that athletic directors and other institutions had some of their athletes sign? Is that right, James?
About COVID?
Yes, Jack. So actually, I have a question about the waiver consent as to litigation, right? So regarding COVID-19 infection or health injuries is very normal, the question for this era.
No, I think I understand your point. When it came out, when our schools some of them might have asked for waivers of liability, that obviously created quite a stir. But here's the bottom line. A lot of press was written, well, these colleges are forcing these kids to play and they're only doing it for money. That was one narrative. But the fact is that 90% of these kids want to play. I mean, if I were at Maryland right now and I saw my career being put on hold because of COVID, I might be willing to take some rest, particularly if I have good sound medical advice going back to the medical model where I can make sure that, I'm not going to get myocarditis or any kind of heart problems from this. So this needs to be a collaborative decision. It's not just the school saying play, it's also the student athletes. And number one, any one of them should be able to opt out and say, I just don't feel comfortable playing. And I want to sit out and I want my scholarship protected. And I think that's the proper model. I mean, kids that don't want to play fully understand, shouldn't be penalized for that. But if kids want to play under really strict medical protocols, I think they should have that opportunity. And that's the balancing act. And oftentimes the press narrative was, just the opposite of that. Somehow the schools are forcing these kids to play, and that's far from true. I've talked to a lot of student athletes, and they see this as a fleeting moment in their life, and they want to get out there and play as much as they could possibly can, as long as they're taking reasonable risks.
All right.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, James, for that question. I think it's now that now that we're reaching the end of the hour, Tom, I'd like to give you the final word. Any final remarks you'd like to provide on this issue would be greatly appreciated.
Well, you know, in the history of sports, and I've been following this really since I left the NBA, student right advancements, athlete advancement has been part of it, whether it's free agency or all the things that have happened in professional sports. And we see a similar trend in college sports. When I was writing my book in 1991, I said, it's inevitable that student athletes will ask for a lot more when one side of the table is totally unfettered with how much they get. So if a coach, an administrator, anybody can say, look, I want to hire the best lawyers, I want to be protected, it's inevitable student athletes were going to ask for that. But the real question we have to ask ourselves is, what do we want college sports to look like in the future in a model of higher education? And that's what we really need some serious thought in this country about, because a lot of change is coming. Effective free agencies here. Kids are going to be able to transfer that one transfer, you know, without question. You're going to have the Alston case get implemented, where kids are going to be actually making more money than they are now. And third, you're going to have NIL. And so you have a lot of changes coming to college sports. And, you know, what I like about college sports is the fact that this gives young student athletes opportunities. And if the result of all these changes end up meaning that we're cutting thousands and thousands of student athletes from opportunities and hundreds and thousands of other Olympic sports, I'm concerned about that. And I think our ADs are as well. And so we're going to have a hard look at this, because I don't think college sports will look anything like it does today 5 years from now. And we have to be prepared for that ride, and we have to be prepared to make the changes to keep it, you know, in the kind of equilibrium that we all love about college sports. That is, that giving kids opportunities to go to college, get a degree. Kids that don't want to go to college should have pathways to the pros, and doing it all within the model of higher education. That's a big challenge, and we'll see how it goes over the next 5 years.
Yeah, and I totally agree. And, you know, that's the whole thing we're talking about, is the future of college sports. And, you know, everyone on this call and the calls that we've had are fans or are interested in working in the industry. And I imagine everyone just wants to make it better. So on that note, Tom, we really appreciate you joining us today. It's been a really insightful discussion. I'm glad we had some Terps on here as well. And thank you all for joining us today. And this will be our last event for the 2020 year. So hopefully we'll see you in 2021. Everyone take care.
Thank you very much. And happy Thanksgiving, everybody.